The rain hammered against the glass windows of the exclusive Hartwell Private Academy's main entrance as 12-year-old Marcus Thompson clutched his worn backpack tighter against his chest. The faded blue shirt he wore, carefully mended at the elbow by his grandmother's patient hands, stood in stark contrast to the crisp uniforms and designer clothing that surrounded him in the marble-floored lobby. His sneakers, once white but now a tired gray from countless washes and wear, squeaked softly against the polished floor as he made his way toward the scholarship office. Marcus had earned his place at Hartwell through exceptional academic performance at his public elementary school, but walking through these hallowed halls made him feel like an intruder in a world where privilege was worn as naturally as the expensive watches that adorned his classmates' wrists. The scholarship covered his tuition, but it couldn't purchase the invisible armor of confidence that seemed to protect the other students from the kind of scrutiny he felt bearing down on him at every turn. As he approached the administrative wing, Marcus couldn't help but notice the way conversations seemed to pause when he passed, how eyes would linger on his patched clothing before turning away with barely concealed disdain. He had learned early in his first semester to keep his head down, to make himself as invisible as possible, but today felt different. Today, the weight of being different seemed heavier somehow. The sound of expensive leather shoes clicking against the marble caught his attention, and Marcus instinctively stepped aside to make room for whoever was approaching. The man who swept past him was everything Marcus had learned to associate with power and wealth at Hartwell. Tall and impeccably dressed in a charcoal gray suit that probably cost more than Marcus's family spent on groceries in 6 months, the man carried himself with the kind of casual arrogance that came from never having to question one's place in the world. Richard Blackwood, as Marcus would later learn his name, was indeed a man accustomed to commanding respect through the mere force of his presence. At 45, he had built a technology empire that had made him one of the youngest billionaires in the country. His company, Blackwood Industries, had revolutionized data processing and artificial intelligence applications, making him a regular fixture on magazine covers and television interviews. But success had come with a price that Richard had never bothered to calculate, transforming what might have once been simple confidence into something far more corrosive. As Richard strode through the lobby, his piercing blue eyes scanning the environment with the calculating precision of a man who viewed every situation as a potential business opportunity, his gaze fell upon Marcus. The boy's appearance seemed to offend Richard's sensibilities in a way that was both immediate and visceral. Here, in this temple to academic excellence and social privilege, was a reminder of everything Richard had worked so hard to distance himself from. Richard's own childhood had been spent in circumstances not entirely unlike Marcus's current situation, though he had buried those memories so deeply that they rarely surfaced anymore. The son of a struggling single mother who worked 3 jobs to keep food on their table, Richard had clawed his way out of poverty through a combination of intellectual brilliance, ruthless determination, and a gradual hardening of his heart that had allowed him to leave behind anyone and anything that might slow his ascent. But standing in that lobby, looking at Marcus's carefully mended shirt and worn shoes, Richard felt something stirring in the depths of his carefully constructed persona. Instead of recognition or compassion, however, what emerged was something far uglier, a need to assert his dominance over this reminder of his own humble origins. "Excuse me, young man," Richard called out, his voice carrying the kind of authority that was accustomed to immediate attention. The conversations in the lobby began to fade as other parents and students turned to observe what was clearly going to be some kind of confrontation. Marcus looked up, his dark eyes meeting Richard's gaze with a mixture of uncertainty and wariness that spoke to hard-won experience with situations where powerful adults had singled him out for unwelcome attention. "Yes, sir," he replied quietly, his voice carrying the careful politeness that his grandmother had drilled into him from an early age. Richard's lips curved into what might have been mistaken for a smile if not for the cold calculation behind his eyes. "I couldn't help but notice your attire," he said, the word dripping with disdain as his gaze traveled deliberately from Marcus's worn sneakers to his faded shirt. "Are you quite certain you're in the right place? This is Hartwell Academy, not some public school charity case collection center." The words hit Marcus like physical blows, each syllable designed to cut deep and expose the insecurities that he had worked so hard to keep hidden beneath a facade of quiet dignity. He felt heat rising in his cheeks, a combination of embarrassment and anger that made his hands tremble slightly as he gripped his backpack straps. Around them, the lobby had grown completely silent, all pretense of private conversation abandoned as the assembled crowd focused their attention on the unfolding drama. "I belong here," Marcus said, his voice barely above a whisper but carrying a thread of steel that surprised even himself. "I earned my place through the academic scholarship program. Richard's laugh was sharp and brittle, echoing off the marble surfaces of the lobby like the crack of breaking glass. "Earned your place," he repeated mockingly. "By what measure?" "Clearly not by any standard that includes basic human dignity or respect for the environment you've been so generously allowed to enter. Look at yourself, boy. That shirt looks like it was retrieved from a donation bin, and those shoes, well, I've seen homeless individuals with better footwear." The cruelty of Richard's words seemed to energize something dark within him, as if the act of diminishing this child was feeding some hungry part of his soul that had been waiting for just such an opportunity. He stepped closer to Marcus, using his considerable height advantage to loom over the boy in a way that was clearly meant to intimidate. "Perhaps," Richard continued, his voice growing louder and more theatrical as he played to his audience, "the administration should reconsider their charity policies. After all, what message does it send to the paying families when scholarship students arrive looking like refugees from a disaster zone? Standards exist for a reason, and clearly, some people simply aren't capable of meeting them, regardless of whatever academic tricks they might have learned." Marcus felt the world telescoping around him, the lobby becoming a stage where his humiliation was being performed for the entertainment of an audience that seemed to be drinking in every moment of his degradation. He wanted to run, to escape this nightmare and never return, but something deeper and more fundamental kept his feet planted firmly on the marble floor. His grandmother's voice echoed in his memory, reminding him that dignity wasn't something that could be taken away by others, only surrendered by oneself. "My clothes don't define my worth," Marcus said, his voice growing stronger with each word. "And my family's financial situation doesn't determine my potential or my right to be here. I earned my scholarship through academic excellence, and I'll continue to prove that I deserve to be here through my performance, not through the price tag on my shirt." The response seemed to genuinely surprise Richard, who had clearly expected the boy to crumble under the assault. Instead, he found himself facing a composure and dignity that was remarkable in someone so young. Rather than causing him to reconsider his behavior, however, Marcus's resilience only seemed to inflame Richard's need to establish dominance. "Academic excellence?" Richard scoffed. "From someone who can't even afford decent clothing? Tell me, boy, what exactly do you plan to contribute to this institution beyond lowering the overall standard of appearance? Do you imagine that your presence here is somehow inspiring to your classmates, or do you think they see you as nothing more than a cautionary tale about what happens when standards are relaxed?" The crowd around them was growing larger now, as word of the confrontation spread through the lobby and drew curious onlookers from the surrounding corridors. Some faces showed discomfort at the brutal public humiliation they were witnessing, but others reflected a kind of fascinated entertainment, as if they were watching a particularly dramatic performance rather than the systematic destruction of a child's dignity. Marcus felt tears threatening at the corners of his eyes, but he refused to allow them to fall. He had learned long ago that showing weakness in situations like this only invited more cruelty, and he was determined not to give Richard the satisfaction of seeing him break. Instead, he straightened his shoulders and looked directly into Richard's eyes with a steady gaze that spoke of inner strength far beyond his years. "I plan to contribute the same thing I've always contributed," Marcus replied, his voice steady despite the emotional storm raging within him. "Hard work, dedication, and a commitment to excellence that doesn't require expensive clothing to validate it. My worth isn't measured by what I wear, but by what I achieve and how I treat others." The subtle rebuke in Marcus's final words seemed to strike Richard like a physical blow, and for a moment, something flickered across his face that might have been shame. But the moment passed quickly, replaced by an even darker anger that transformed his features into something genuinely frightening. "How you treat others?" Richard repeated, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper that somehow carried further than his previous theatrical volume. "You lecturing me about how to treat others? You, a charity case who can't even dress himself appropriately for the institution that has so graciously accepted him? Perhaps it's time someone taught you about your proper place in the world." Richard reached into his jacket pocket and withdrew a leather wallet so expensive it could have paid Marcus's family's rent for 3 months. With deliberate, theatrical movements, he extracted a crisp $100 bill and held it up for the assembled crowd to see. "Here," he said, extending the bill toward Marcus with a gesture that was designed to be as humiliating as possible. "Consider this a charitable donation toward a clothing allowance. Perhaps you can find something more appropriate to wear, something that won't embarrass the other students or reflect poorly on the institution that has shown you such undeserved kindness." The gesture was so calculated, so perfectly designed to maximize humiliation, that it took Marcus's breath away. The $100 bill fluttered slightly in Richard's outstretched hand, and Marcus could feel the weight of every eye in the lobby focused on this moment of ultimate degradation. Richard's smile had become something predatory now, the expression of someone who had found exactly the right pressure point to achieve maximum damage. But even as Marcus felt the world crumbling around him, even as he processed the magnitude of this public humiliation, he found within himself a core of strength that he hadn't known existed. His grandmother's teachings about dignity and self-worth, lessons that had seemed abstract and philosophical in their quiet apartment, suddenly became very real and practical tools for survival. "I don't want your money," Marcus said clearly, his voice cutting through the tense silence of the lobby with remarkable clarity. "And I don't need your approval or your charity. My clothing may be worn, but it's clean and honest. It represents a family that works hard for everything we have and doesn't compromise our principles for convenience or social acceptance." The rejection of Richard's offer seemed to hit the older man like a physical blow. He stared at Marcus for a long moment, the $100 bill still extended between them like a bridge that the boy had refused to cross. Richard's face cycled through a range of emotions, surprise, anger, and something that might have been grudging respect, before settling back into cold fury. "Principles?" Richard laughed harshly. "What principles could someone in your position possibly have that would be worth maintaining? Pride is a luxury that people like you can't afford, boy. Take the money and learn your lesson about gratitude and proper behavior." "The lesson I'm learning," Marcus replied with a maturity that seemed to age him years in the space of a few words, "is that having money doesn't automatically make someone a good person, and that true wealth has nothing to do with what you can buy and everything to do with how you choose to treat others." The words hung in the air between them like a challenge thrown down by a knight before a duel. Richard's face flushed red with an anger that went beyond mere embarrassment at being publicly contradicted by a child. This was the fury of someone whose entire worldview had been called into question by someone he considered fundamentally inferior. "You impudent little," Richard began, taking a step forward that brought him into Marcus's personal space in a way that was clearly meant to intimidate. But before he could finish his threat, a new voice cut through the tension like a knife. "Richard Blackwood." The voice was quiet, controlled, and carried an authority that was somehow more commanding than Richard's bluster had ever been. Every head in the lobby turned toward the source, and Richard himself seemed to freeze mid-motion, his face suddenly draining of color as he processed the implications of that particular voice speaking his name in that particular tone. Standing at the entrance to the administrative wing was a man who commanded attention not through expensive clothing or theatrical gestures, but through the simple force of his presence. Dr. James Thompson was not a large man physically, standing perhaps 5 feet 10 inches tall with a slender build that spoke more of intellectual pursuits than physical labor. His graying hair was neatly combed but not styled, and his clothing, while clean and professional, was clearly chosen for function rather than fashion. But there was something about Dr. Thompson that made Richard's wealth and bluster seem suddenly insignificant. Perhaps it was the way he carried himself, with the quiet confidence of someone who had never needed to prove his worth to others. Perhaps it was the intelligence that shone in his dark eyes, the same eyes that Marcus had inherited. Or perhaps it was simply the moral authority that seemed to radiate from him like heat from a flame. Dr. James Thompson was, though few people in the lobby knew it at that moment, one of the most respected research physicians in the country. His work in pediatric oncology had saved thousands of children's lives, and his research into innovative treatment protocols had earned him recognition from medical institutions around the world. He had been offered positions at prestigious hospitals and research facilities that would have made him wealthy beyond imagination, but he had consistently chosen to remain at the public hospital where he could do the most good for the greatest number of people. More importantly, at least in the context of this moment, Dr. Thompson was Marcus's father. The recognition dawned on Richard's face like a sunrise, slow at first and then with increasing brightness as the full implications became clear. Dr. James Thompson, the man whose research had revolutionized pediatric cancer treatment. Dr. James Thompson, whom Richard had met at several charity galas and medical fundraising events. Dr. James Thompson, whose work Richard's own charitable foundation had supported to the tune of millions of dollars over the years. Dr. James Thompson, whose brilliant research had saved the life of Richard's own nephew 3 years earlier when the boy had been diagnosed with a rare form of leukemia. Dr. Thompson, Richard managed, his voice suddenly lacking all of its previous confidence and authority. The $100 bill was still in his hand, but now it seemed to burn his fingers like a brand of shame. Dr. Thompson moved through the crowd with the measured pace of someone who was accustomed to dealing with crisis situations. His eyes never left Richard's face, but Marcus could see the tension in his father's jaw, the careful control that was keeping powerful emotions in check. When Dr. Thompson reached his son, he placed a gentle but protective hand on Marcus's shoulder, a gesture that spoke of love and support more clearly than any words could have done. "I believe," Dr. Thompson said, his voice remaining carefully modulated despite the situation, "that you were just offering my son money for new clothing. How thoughtful of you to take such a personal interest in his appearance." The sarcasm in Dr. Thompson's voice was subtle but unmistakable, and Richard seemed to shrink under its weight. The crowd around them was beginning to understand the dynamics of what they were witnessing, and whispered conversations were spreading the news through the lobby like wildfire. Richard Blackwood, the technology mogul and major donor to the school, had just been caught publicly humiliating the son of one of the most respected doctors in the country. "Dr. Thompson," Richard began, but found himself unable to complete the sentence. How could he explain his behavior? How could he justify the cruelty he had shown to the son of a man whose work he genuinely respected and admired? "Please," Dr. Thompson said, his voice remaining quiet but carrying easily through the silent lobby, "don't let me interrupt. I was simply coming to collect my son after his tutoring session, but I couldn't help but overhear your conversation about clothing and standards and proper behavior. Please, continue with your lesson. I'm quite interested to hear what educational insights you might have to share." Marcus looked up at his father, seeing in his calm exterior the same controlled strength that had gotten him through his own confrontation with Richard. Dr. Thompson's hand on his shoulder was steady and warm, an anchor in the storm of emotions that had been raging through the lobby for the past several minutes. Richard's mouth opened and closed several times, but no words emerged. The man who had been so articulate in his cruelty, so confident in his moral authority, seemed to have lost the ability to speak coherently. The $100 bill trembled in his hand, and Marcus could see sweat beginning to form on his forehead despite the cool temperature of the lobby. "Perhaps," Dr. Thompson continued when it became clear that Richard was not going to respond, "you were about to explain to my son how a person's worth should be measured by the cost of their clothing rather than the content of their character. Or maybe you were planning to elaborate on your theory that financial circumstances somehow determine moral value. I confess, these are concepts that I've struggled with in my own work, particularly when I'm treating children whose families can't afford the best of everything but who show remarkable courage and dignity in the face of life-threatening illness." The words were delivered with surgical precision, each phrase calculated to maximum effect without ever crossing the line into overt hostility. Dr. Thompson was dismantling Richard's position with the same methodical care he would use to excise a tumor, removing the diseased tissue while preserving everything healthy around it. Richard's face was now completely red, a combination of embarrassment, anger, and something that might have been shame. The crowd around them was growing restless, some people beginning to edge away from what was clearly becoming an uncomfortable situation for the man who was undoubtedly one of the school's most significant benefactors. "Dr. Thompson," Richard finally managed to say, his voice cracking slightly on the words, "I didn't realize. I wasn't aware that Marcus was your son." "And if he had been someone else's son," Dr. Thompson replied smoothly, "your behavior would have been acceptable. If Marcus had been the child of a janitor or a cashier or an unemployed single mother, would that have made your cruelty justified?" The question hung in the air like an accusation, and Richard found himself unable to provide any answer that wouldn't make him sound even worse than he already did. The logic was inescapable. Either his behavior was wrong regardless of Marcus's parentage, or he was admitting that he believed some children deserved to be treated with less dignity than others based purely on their family's economic circumstances. Marcus watched this exchange with fascination and growing understanding. His father wasn't just defending him, he was teaching a lesson about human dignity and the danger of making assumptions based on appearances. Dr. Thompson was using this moment not just to protect his son, but to illuminate larger truths about prejudice and the way society treated its most vulnerable members. Richard began again, then stopped, seeming to realize that any explanation he might offer would only make his position worse. The $100 bill was still in his hand, now crumpled from his nervous grip, a physical reminder of the moment when his arrogance had led him to make one of the worst mistakes of his adult life. Dr. Thompson seemed to sense Richard's distress, and Marcus could see his father's expression soften slightly. This wasn't about destroying Richard or maximizing his humiliation, it was about teaching a lesson and protecting not just Marcus, but all the other children who might find themselves in similar situations. Mr. Blackwood," Dr. Thompson said, using Richard's surname rather than his first name in a subtle reminder of the professional distance that now existed between them. "I understand that this situation has become uncomfortable for you. Perhaps we could step into the administrative office and discuss this matter more privately." The offer was a lifeline, a chance for Richard to salvage some dignity from the wreckage of his public humiliation. Marcus could see the relief flooding across the older man's face, the gratitude of someone who had been offered an escape from a situation that had spiraled completely beyond his control. But even as Richard nodded eagerly at the suggestion, Dr. Thompson held up a gentle hand to pause the movement toward privacy. "However," he continued, his voice remaining calm but carrying a note of steel, "I think there's something that needs to be said here, in front of everyone who witnessed what just occurred." Marcus felt his father's hand tighten slightly on his shoulder, a gesture of support and solidarity that gave him strength even as he dreaded what might be coming next. He had no desire to prolong this public confrontation, but he trusted his father's judgment completely. Dr. Thompson turned slightly so that he was addressing not just Richard, but the entire crowd that had gathered to witness the confrontation. His voice, trained by years of delivering difficult news to families in crisis, carried clearly through the marble-walled space. "What we've witnessed here today," Dr. Thompson said, "is a perfect example of how easy it is to make assumptions about people based on their appearance, and how dangerous those assumptions can be. My son Marcus is indeed a scholarship student at this school. His clothing is indeed secondhand, carefully maintained by his grandmother who takes pride in keeping him clean and presentable despite our family's modest means." Marcus felt a flush of pride mixed with embarrassment as his father spoke. There was no shame in Dr. Thompson's voice as he acknowledged their family's financial circumstances, no apology for not being wealthy enough to afford designer clothing for his son. "But what Mr. Blackwood couldn't have known from looking at Marcus," Dr. Thompson continued, "is that this boy consistently ranks in the top 5% of his class academically. He volunteers at our local food bank every weekend, helping to distribute meals to families who are struggling even more than we are. He reads to elderly patients at the hospital where I work, bringing them comfort and companionship during difficult times. He has already been accepted to 3 different summer science programs despite being only 12 years old." With each accomplishment Dr. Thompson listed, Marcus could see Richard's face growing paler. The man who had dismissed Marcus as that charity case was being forced to confront the reality of who this child actually was beyond the superficial judgments he had made based on appearance. More importantly, Dr. Thompson's voice grew stronger, more passionate. "What Mr. Blackwood couldn't see is that Marcus has already demonstrated more genuine character, more real dignity, and more authentic worth than many adults twice his age. He faced this public humiliation with grace and courage that I frankly find inspiring." Marcus felt tears threatening again, but this time they were tears of gratitude and love for his father rather than tears of humiliation and pain. Dr. Thompson was not just defending him, he was seeing him, truly seeing him in a way that made Marcus feel valued and appreciated for who he actually was rather than dismissed for what he lacked. "As for our family's financial circumstances," Dr. Thompson continued, his gaze moving back to Richard with laser intensity, "I am indeed not a wealthy man by most standards. I chose to dedicate my career to treating children with cancer at a public hospital rather than pursuing more lucrative opportunities. My wife, Marcus's mother, was a social worker who dedicated her life to helping families in crisis before she passed away 4 years ago. We have never owned expensive cars or lived in large houses or worn designer clothing." The mention of Marcus's mother brought a hush over the crowd that was even deeper than before. Marcus felt his father's grip on his shoulder strengthen, and he knew that Dr. Thompson was drawing on painful memories to make this point. "But I have had the privilege," Dr. Thompson's voice grew quiet but somehow more powerful, "of saving the lives of hundreds of children over the course of my career. I have been able to help families navigate the most frightening experience of their lives and come out the other side with hope and healing. I have contributed to research that has revolutionized treatment protocols and given countless children the chance to grow up and live full lives." Richard's face was now completely white, and Marcus could see that the man was beginning to understand the full magnitude of his mistake. Dr. James Thompson was not just any doctor, he was a legend in his field, someone whose work had touched the lives of thousands of families and whose reputation extended far beyond the medical community. "In fact," Dr. Thompson said, his voice taking on a note that was almost conversational, "I believe that your nephew, David Blackwood, was one of my patients about 3 years ago. Acute lymphoblastic leukemia, if I remember correctly. Quite a challenging case, but we were able to achieve complete remission using a protocol that I had helped develop. He should be doing well now, I hope. The question hit Richard like a physical blow, and Marcus could actually see the moment when the full irony of the situation crashed over the older man. Richard's nephew, the child whose life Dr. Thompson had saved, had received treatment from the father of the boy Richard had just publicly humiliated for being poor. David is, Richard's voice was barely audible, he's doing very well. He's healthy and happy and back to playing soccer and just being a normal kid again. Because of you. Because of your work. I'm glad to hear that, Dr. Thompson said simply. It's always wonderful to hear about former patients thriving. I hope you'll give him my regards. The simple grace of Dr. Thompson's response, his lack of vindictiveness or cruelty even in this moment of complete moral victory, seemed to break something inside Richard. The man who had been so confident in his superiority, so certain of his right to judge and humiliate others, suddenly looked older and smaller and infinitely more human. Dr. Thompson, Richard said, his voice shaking with emotion, I owe you an apology. Actually, I owe both of you an apology, but particularly Marcus. My behavior was inexcusable, and I have no defense for it except my own ignorance and prejudice. Marcus looked up at his father, uncertain how to respond to this unexpected turn of events. Dr. Thompson nodded slightly, a signal that it was okay for Marcus to accept the apology if he chose to do so. I accept your apology, Marcus said quietly, his voice carrying a maturity that seemed to surprise even himself. Everyone makes mistakes. What matters is what we learn from them. The generosity of Marcus's response seemed to affect Richard even more deeply than his father's moral authority had. Here was a child, someone he had just finished publicly humiliating and degrading, offering him forgiveness and understanding. The contrast between Marcus's grace and his own cruelty couldn't have been more stark. You're a remarkable young man, Richard said to Marcus, his voice thick with emotion. And I'm deeply ashamed of how I treated you. You handled this situation with more dignity than I've shown in years. Dr. Thompson watched this exchange with careful attention, and Marcus could see that his father was evaluating Richard's sincerity, determining whether this apology was genuine or simply motivated by embarrassment at being caught. Mr. Blackwood, Dr. Thompson said finally, I appreciate your apology, and I believe Marcus does as well. But I hope you'll understand that words alone aren't sufficient to address what happened here today. This wasn't just a personal attack on my son, it was a reflection of attitudes and prejudices that affect countless children in similar circumstances. Richard nodded eagerly, clearly desperate to find some way to make amends for his behavior. What can I do? He asked. How can I make this right? Dr. Thompson was quiet for a long moment, considering his response. Marcus could practically see his father's mind working, weighing options and considering consequences in the same methodical way he approached medical decisions. I think, Dr. Thompson said slowly, that this situation presents an opportunity for education and growth, both for you personally and for the broader community. Marcus isn't the only scholarship student at this school, and he certainly won't be the last. Perhaps there's a way to use this experience to create something positive. Richard's eyes lit up with the possibility of redemption, and Marcus could see that the businessman in him was already beginning to formulate plans and strategies. Yes, he said eagerly. Whatever you think would be appropriate. I want to make this right. Well, Dr. Thompson said, glancing around the lobby at the crowd that was still watching their every move, it seems to me that the best way to honor the lesson we've all learned today would be to ensure that other students don't have to face similar situations. Perhaps a program that provides clothing and supplies for scholarship students, administered with dignity and respect rather than as charity that creates shame. Marcus felt a surge of admiration for his father's wisdom. Rather than simply accepting Richard's apology and moving on, Dr. Thompson was finding a way to transform this painful experience into something that could benefit other students who might find themselves in similar circumstances. That's a wonderful idea, Richard said, his voice growing stronger as he began to see a path toward redemption. I could fund such a program. We could work with the school administration to identify students who might benefit, and provide support in a way that preserves their dignity. But, Dr. Thompson held up a gentle hand, it would be important that such a program be administered properly. Not as charity that creates shame, but as support that recognizes the value and potential of every student regardless of their family's financial circumstances. Richard nodded vigorously, and Marcus could see that the man was genuinely committed to making amends. The transformation from the arrogant bully who had confronted Marcus to this humbled individual seeking redemption was remarkable, and Marcus found himself feeling something approaching sympathy for Richard's obvious distress. "There's something else," Dr. Thompson continued, his voice taking on a more serious tone. "I think it would be valuable for you to spend some time understanding the reality of what life is like for families who struggle financially. Not from a distance, as a donor or benefactor, but up close and personal." Richard looked confused, unsure what Dr. Thompson was suggesting. Marcus was equally puzzled, wondering where his father was leading with this idea. "I'd like to invite you to volunteer at the hospital," Dr. Thompson explained. "Not in any official capacity, just as someone who helps with small tasks and spends time with patients and families. I think you might find it educational to see how people face real hardship with grace and dignity, how children cope with serious illness, how families support each other when they have very little beyond their love for one another." The suggestion clearly took Richard by surprise, but Marcus could see that he was considering it seriously. The idea of Richard Blackwood, technology mogul and billionaire, volunteering at a public hospital was almost surreal, but there was something appealing about the symmetry of it. "I would be honored," Richard said slowly, and Marcus could hear that he meant it. "When would you like me to start?" "How about next week?" Dr. Thompson suggested. "I think it would be good for you to see a different side of life, and I suspect the patients would enjoy meeting you. Just remember that you'll be there as a helper and a listener, not as a benefactor or someone to be impressed." Richard nodded, understanding the distinction Dr. Thompson was making. This wasn't about allowing him to feel good about his wealth by distributing it to the deserving poor, it was about learning to see people as individuals with inherent worth regardless of their circumstances. The crowd around them was beginning to disperse now that the immediate drama had passed, but Marcus could see people glancing back at them with expressions of curiosity and respect. Word of this confrontation would spread quickly through the school community, but the story that emerged would be quite different from what anyone had expected when it began. "Marcus," Dr. Thompson said, turning his attention to his son, "are you ready to go home? I think we've had enough excitement for one day." Marcus nodded, suddenly feeling exhausted by the emotional intensity of the past hour. The adrenaline that had sustained him through his confrontation with Richard was beginning to fade, leaving him drained and eager for the quiet sanctuary of their modest apartment. As they began to walk toward the exit, Richard called out after them. "Dr. Thompson, Marcus, wait please." They turned back to find Richard approaching them with something that looked like genuine humility replacing his earlier arrogance. The $100 bill was still in his hand, but now he looked at it as if he wasn't quite sure what to do with it. "I want you both to know," Richard said, his voice carrying more sincerity than Marcus had heard from him all day, "that this has been one of the most important conversations of my life. I've spent so many years focused on success and achievement and accumulating wealth that I forgot some fundamental truths about human dignity and worth." He paused, looking down at the crumpled bill in his hand. "I earned my first $1 million by the time I was 25, he said quietly. "I thought that made me better than other people, smarter, more deserving. I forgot that I started with advantages that many people never have, and I forgot to be grateful for the help I received along the way." Marcus found himself listening with genuine interest as Richard continued. There was something compelling about this moment of self-reflection from someone who had seemed so confident in his superiority just minutes before. "When I saw Marcus in his worn shirt and old shoes," Richard continued, "I saw everything I had worked so hard to distance myself from. My own childhood was spent wearing second-hand clothes and trying to hide my family's poverty from classmates who had so much more than we did. But instead of feeling compassion for someone in a similar situation, I felt anger and resentment, as if his presence somehow diminished what I had achieved." Dr. Thompson listened to this confession with the same careful attention he gave to his patients, and Marcus could see that his father was beginning to understand the psychological dynamics that had driven Richard's cruelty. "The irony," Richard said with a bitter smile, "is that Marcus handled this situation with more grace and dignity than I've shown in years of business dealings. He has qualities that no amount of money can buy, qualities that I seem to have lost somewhere along the way to financial success. Those qualities can be rediscovered," Dr. Thompson said gently. "It's never too late to remember what really matters and to start treating people with the respect and dignity they deserve." Richard nodded, then did something that surprised both Marcus and his father. He carefully tore the $100 bill in half, then in half again, letting the pieces fall to the marble floor of the lobby. "I don't ever want to forget this moment," he said quietly. I don't ever want to forget how close I came to being the kind of person I would have despised as a child. That money was meant to be an insult, a way to put Marcus in what I thought was his proper place. I never want to use wealth as a weapon against someone again. The gesture was dramatic but somehow appropriate, a symbolic rejection of the mentality that had led to the confrontation in the first place. Marcus found himself genuinely moved by Richard's willingness to acknowledge his mistakes and commit to change. As they finally made their way out of the school and into Dr. Thompson's modest sedan, Marcus reflected on the extraordinary events of the afternoon. What had begun as one of the most humiliating experiences of his young life had transformed into something approaching triumph, not through any action of his own, but through his father's wisdom and Richard's ultimate willingness to confront his own prejudices. The drive home was quiet, both Marcus and his father processing what had occurred. It wasn't until they were sitting in their small kitchen, sharing a simple dinner of soup and sandwiches, that Marcus finally found the words to express what he was feeling. "Dad," he said quietly, "thank you for standing up for me today. I felt so alone and scared when Mr. Blackwood was saying those things, but when you arrived, everything changed." Dr. Thompson reached across the table and covered his son's hand with his own. "Marcus, I want you to understand something important. You didn't need me to validate your worth or prove that you deserve respect. You had already done that through the way you handled yourself in an incredibly difficult situation." Marcus looked up at his father, confused. "But he was so cruel, and I felt so powerless." "You were never powerless," Dr. Thompson said firmly. "You chose to maintain your dignity rather than responding with anger or cruelty. You chose to speak truth rather than allowing his attacks to go unchallenged. You chose forgiveness when he apologized, even though you had every right to be angry. Those were all choices that demonstrated your character and strength." As Marcus considered his father's words, he began to understand that the real victory hadn't come when Dr. Thompson arrived to defend him. It had come in those moments when he chose to stand up for himself with grace and courage, when he refused to let Richard's cruelty define his worth or diminish his dignity. Over the following weeks, Marcus watched with interest as Richard followed through on his commitments. The clothing and supplies program was established at the school, administered with the kind of sensitivity and respect that Dr. Thompson had insisted upon. More importantly, Richard began volunteering at the hospital, arriving each week to help with small tasks and spend time with patients and families. Marcus had occasion to observe some of these interactions when he accompanied his father to work, and he was struck by the genuine transformation that seemed to be taking place in Richard. The arrogant businessman was slowly being replaced by someone more humble and compassionate, someone who was learning to see past surfaces to the fundamental humanity that connected all people. The hospital volunteering proved to be a profound education for Richard. He met families who faced catastrophic medical bills with grace and determination, children who endured painful treatments without complaint, parents who worked multiple jobs to support their families while never missing a single hospital visit. He began to understand that poverty was not a moral failing or a sign of laziness, but often the result of circumstances beyond individual control. One afternoon, Marcus encountered Richard in the hospital playroom, sitting on the floor playing board games with a group of young patients. The expensive suit had been replaced by simple khakis and a polo shirt, and Richard's entire demeanor had changed. He was laughing at something one of the children had said, and Marcus could see genuine joy and connection in his interactions. "He's really changed, hasn't he?" Dr. Thompson observed, joining Marcus in the doorway. "It's amazing," Marcus replied. "He seems like a completely different person." "People can change when they are given the opportunity and the motivation," Dr. Thompson said. "Sometimes it takes a significant shock to break through the barriers we've built around ourselves, but the capacity for growth and redemption exists in almost everyone." As the months passed, Marcus continued to excel academically while also developing a deeper understanding of the complexities of human nature. The incident with Richard had taught him that people were rarely as simple as they appeared on the surface, that cruelty often masked fear or insecurity, and that even those who seemed powerful and confident could be struggling with their own demons. Richard's transformation continued as well. He began using his wealth and influence not just to fund charitable programs, but to advocate for systemic changes that would address the root causes of inequality. He spoke at conferences about the dangers of judging people based on appearance or circumstances, sharing his own story as a cautionary tale about the corrosive effects of prejudice and privilege. The relationship between Richard and Marcus's family evolved into something approaching friendship, though it was a friendship built on mutual respect rather than obligation or guilt. Richard continued to volunteer at the hospital, finding in that work a sense of purpose and connection that his business success had never provided. One evening, nearly a year after their first encounter, Richard joined the Thompson family for dinner at their modest apartment. As they sat around the small table sharing a simple meal, Marcus reflected on the extraordinary journey that had brought them all to this point. "You know," Richard said during a lull in the conversation, "that day in the school lobby was simultaneously the worst and best moment of my adult life. Worst because it showed me how far I had fallen from the values I claimed to hold, but best because it gave me the opportunity to find my way back to being someone I could respect." Marcus smiled at the older man who had become such an important part of their lives. "I'm glad it happened too," he said. "Not because I enjoyed being humiliated, but because it taught me so much about forgiveness and second chances and the possibility of change." Dr. Thompson looked around the table at his son and their unlikely friend, feeling a deep satisfaction at the way pain and conflict had been transformed into growth and understanding. These were the moments that made all of life's struggles worthwhile, when human beings chose connection over division, compassion over cruelty, hope over despair. As Marcus prepared for high school, with Richard's mentorship supplementing his father's guidance and his grandmother's wisdom, he carried with him the lessons learned during that difficult afternoon in the school lobby. He had discovered that true wealth lay not in material possessions but in character, that dignity was not something that could be taken away by others but only surrendered by oneself, and that even the most painful experiences could be transformed into opportunities for growth and understanding. The worn shirt that had sparked such controversy was carefully folded away in Marcus's dresser, not because he was ashamed of it, but because it had become a symbol of everything he had learned about the difference between surface appearances and inner worth. He occasionally took it out to look at it, remembering not just the pain of that day, but the triumph of maintaining his dignity in the face of cruelty and the joy of watching someone discover their capacity for redemption. Years later, when Marcus had become a successful engineer and was facing his own challenges in treating others with fairness and compassion, he would think back to that day and remember the lessons learned from both his father's wisdom and Richard's transformation. He understood that the capacity for both cruelty and kindness existed within everyone, and that the choice between them was renewed with every interaction, every moment of decision about how to treat the people we encounter in our daily lives. The story of the millionaire who mocked a boy's old shirt had become something much larger than a simple tale of confrontation and apology. It had become a testament to the power of grace under pressure, the possibility of redemption through genuine change, and the profound truth that our worth as human beings is measured not by what we own or wear, but by how we choose to treat one another in moments of both comfort and crisis.